This is a Reforge reaction, and in this video, I'm going to be reacting to an MSN.com article that says, why God of War Ragnarok is not Game of the Year. I've skimmed it. It doesn't contain any major spoilers, really, at all. This will be a fun one to react to. I've played the game quite a bit, probably about 30 hours worth. So let's get into this. If you like this reaction, hit subscribe. You can check out my other reactions and check out Reforge Gaming. That's where I do my live streaming content. So why God of War Ragnarok's not Game of the Year? I can't believe a company and platform owned by Microsoft is saying this. This is a real shocker here. So it says the biggest PlayStation game of 2022 is out now, but is the critical acclaim deserved? And what does it say about the state of video game reviews today? So apparently they're going to tell us about game reviews and maybe how they're not trustworthy because they don't agree with you. Anyway, God of War Ragnarok on PlayStation 5 currently has a 94 out of 100 rating on Metacritic. That's the second highest of the year outside of Elden Ring and a couple of reissues of older games, Portal 1 and 2 on Switch and Persona 5 on PC. In our review, though, we only gave the game an 8 out of 10 score. And while it will certainly appear in our top 20 of the year, we don't feel Ragnarok was quite as good as its predecessor. Okay, so that's going to be how they gauge this, it seems, because we do know that, God of War 2018 won Game of the Year, so they're going to be judging it against that. Despite the overall number of new releases being low this year, not quite as low as last year, but still obviously affected by the pandemic, this has been a pretty good year for games. We haven't decided on our actual Game of the Year yet for obvious reasons, but some of the top contenders include not just Elden Ring, but Bayonetta 3, Immortality, and Hyper Demon. I've not heard of either of these two in the realm of Game of the Year contention. I've heard of them, but I've not heard of them in contention for Game of the Year from anybody. I have heard, obviously, about Elden Ring and Bayonetta 3 getting potential Game of the Year nominations. Some of those games are well known, some less so, but no game's merits will be as heavily argued over as Ragnarok's for the simple fact that it's a console exclusive, and so its perceived quality ties into many fans' views of the PlayStation brand as a whole and the never-ending console war between Sony and Microsoft. People disagree on how good or bad Elden Ring is, but never with the same ferocity with which Ragnarok is debated. I actually agree with that. I do think that Ragnarok is funny enough. It's debated in a way that is just, you can tell people are being critical because of their brand loyalty, which this is literally a Microsoft-owned platform that's saying this, so it's sort of funny. It's the same when new Xbox first-party game is released, if anyone can remember that far back, with many tying their whole identity as gamers to one brand or the other. There are plenty of understandable reasons for this, and it's not necessarily even a bad thing, but it can make discussion of format exclusives very difficult. So they're not really talking about Ragnarok yet. We'll see if they actually do. You only have to read comments on our review to see examples of people having very firm opinions on its quality and the review's veracity days before they could have even possibly played it for themselves. It's something you'll see in comment sections of any review from any website that is accused of being an outlier. A popular phrase that is disturbing in its implication that any dissenting opinion is a statistical anomaly to be instantly ignored. Well, I do think you have to consider if everybody is giving a movie or a video game or a pizza shop, if everyone is giving it a 9 out of 10 and someone gives it like a 6 or a 7, you would say, yeah, that's a statistical anomaly. That's an outlier. That's what it is, like functionally. And it would make you question why. I think that's legitimate. I don't think that means people are guilty of fandom. It's, hey, everybody's giving it a high score. Why didn't you? Well, justify it. We've always been advocates of scoring reviews, but not just because that's part of the fun of reviewing, but because it worries us that the sites that have ditched scores tend to be the more considered sources whose opinions are now no longer represented by aggregate sites like Metacritic. Video game reviews rarely make use of the full scale from 1 to 10, but that's even more of a problem nowadays when the sites most likely to score more thoughtfully don't have scores at all. You might have thought that the whole point of reviews is to be able to get a wide variety of opinions on the same subject, not just for the purposes of judging whether it's worth a purchase, but because it's interesting to see how different people, all with some degree of expert opinion, view the same game. Right, and you're getting sort of into the discussion of, should a game be a game review? You're almost talking about a game review as if it's art. The function of game reviews is very much consumer driven. Like, is it a good game? Is it buggy? Is it glitchy? Is the story told well? Is the voice acting good? Right? They do function more in a consumer way, and I think that that's fine. Look at any movie review on Metacritic, and you'll see a wide range of different verdicts on the same film, running from ecstatic praise to abject despair. This doesn't happen with video game reviews. That's generally true because, again, I think video game reviews are designed to be a consumer function. Like when you go to a particular outlet, they'll find their person that's good and knowledgeable about fighting games to review the fighting game. So they're obviously going to be better equipped to review it for the people looking to buy another fighting game. I don't think this is necessarily a problem. It sounds like they want to make space for people that are like, well, I didn't like the game. Okay, that's not the same as a review. Somebody's like, well, I didn't like the game, or I didn't like that movie. Okay, are they an educated film critic with a background in film? Do they understand how to break down the screen adaptation, the writing, the pacing, the cinematography? Or are they just going to say they didn't like it, right? Same thing with video game reviews. I actually think it makes sense to have very credible, educated people being the ones reviewing them, because consumers don't really give a rip whether or not you just really disliked Elden Ring because it was hard. Like, that wouldn't be a helpful review to anybody. Yes, we're all well aware there's a spectrum of humanity out there, and that varying people are going to experience video games differently. That's not what reviews are supposed to represent. They're supposed to represent educated, credible sources to say whether or not it is a good game or not did you like it or not. I think that's the problem with what they're arguing. Neither Elden Ring nor Ragnarok scored lower than 80 with any publication, which should be impossible. No, it shouldn't be impossible, because again, if you're taking educated people measuring the game's quality and merits within itself, as opposed to being like, I didn't like it, or I thought it was boring, those are not substantive reviews. Those are too opinion-laden to be weighed and considered. Surely there's someone out there that didn't like these games. Told you, I have not read this. I did not pre-read this. I told you they were conflating a review with whether or not somebody liked the game. That's not what reviews are supposed to function as. We've certainly heard from plenty of people that didn't get on with Elden Ring because of its difficulty, its overfamiliarity, its repetition, and its technical issues. We didn't think any of those issues were serious enough to mark it down further than we did, but is world opinion really that uniform? It's hard to imagine that it could or should be. But again, review outlets are not meant to be a reflection of world opinion. Because if they were meant to be a reflection of world opinion, they wouldn't help us. Okay? Because you can take any video game, any movie, any sport, any television show, and you can find someone who thinks it sucks and is terrible. Having review outlets and a distribution of scores representing that reality would not function and be helpful. What did everybody think of the game? What did everybody think of the movie? Well, there's people who loved it, there's people who hated it, and everybody in between. What would be the point of reviews and review outlets then, if it was just such a mismatch of all of the varying opinions that are out there? Perhaps some critics fear fan reprisals if they give an overly negative review, with many gamers treating review scores like a correct answer that every website must try to achieve. I don't think that's true. We've certainly experienced that sort of backlash before, often when our score deviates from the majority only by the smallest degree. But don't take our word for it. Ask the reviewer from IGN Korea who dared to give God of War Ragnarok 6 out of 10 and was promptly issued death threats for their trouble. At time of writing, the review is not listed on Metacritic. Yeah, but the other thing that the IGN Korea review did is they dialed in the DLC criticism, which is laughably intellectually bankrupt. Anybody who refers to God of War Ragnarok as basically DLC is a liar. I will be on record as to say that. They're just a liar. That's just not a substantiated position. You cannot look at the depth of combat gameplay, dialogue, storytelling, all the work that went into Ragnarok. Anybody saying it's basically DLC is just a dishonest liar. They're not telling the truth. They're not representing the game accurately. They're driving some sort of opinion-laden agenda, which is exactly why review outlets aren't supposed to do that. That's not what you're doing. You're measuring the quality of the game. And if you're going to say that this game, which will likely win Game of the Year in my opinion, is basically DLC, no one deserves death threats. When you go into the internet and you say something provocative, the internet will do that. It doesn't make it right, but you can't go surprise Pikachu face when you poke the internet with a provocative statement and then get a bunch of hate as a result. You're basically farming the hate. You know people are going to click on your review when you break from the mold. You know people are going to talk about you and give you clicks and free press when you dial in a meme. David Jaffe was the one who originally referred to Ragnarok as DLC and then quickly tried to walk it back and say that all sequels are DLC, which has got to be one of the dumbest things I think I've ever heard. And that created a negative hate campaign from people who want to see PlayStation and the PlayStation platform not do well. I had lots of Xbox fans they're not even really Xbox fans. They're like anti-Sony fans running with the Ragnarok's basically DLC. So if you want to come out and be respected in the review landscape, and you want to score a game that's getting universal praise, and you want to give it a failing grade, a 60%, and call it basically DLC, well, then expect people to get really angry because it's clear you're doing something that's dishonest. Like, I don't think it serves any purpose to write a review like that that's basically like, I didn't like it. I could write reviews of fighting games and real-time strategy games and talk about how bored I am and how slow they are and how frustrating the combat is and give it a 6. Why would anybody consider that review helpful? I'm not an authority on those games, and it would basically be just me provoking fans of fighting games and real-time strategy games for clicks. I couldn't do like a surprise Pikachu face like, oh my gosh, I gave Super Street Fighter, or not Super Street Fighter, it's just Street Fighter 6. I gave Street Fighter 6 a 5 out of 10 and said it was really hard and I had to hit the buttons a lot. Well, of course I'm going to get a bunch of hate because I'm not providing a review. I'm just doing a lowbrow click farm and saying something stupid. In the minds of some fans, the question is never what's wrong with the game that we or others might have marked it lower than the majority, but what's wrong with the reviewer. It then becomes a mission to defend the honor of the game and its publisher as a siege mentality settles in with clearly defined heroes and villains. We're at the bottom of their article, by the way. Have they substantiated why Ragnarok's not Game of the Year? No, they've merely talked about review culture, which is a red herring. And surprise, surprise, you went with a headline that got me to click and do a reaction. It's not Game of the Year. Why is it not Game of the Year? No substance, no substance, no substance, no argumentation, no defense. We have 2 paragraphs left. I bet it's going to be dizzying intellectual display of argumentative prowess. Okay, here we go. Let's see. For us, though, it's simple. God of War Ragnarok is definitely not Game of the Year. As we explored at length in our review, it's too similar to its predecessor, and yet in most cases not quite as good, with a weaker plot, not true, wasted skill tree abilities, and overfamiliar locations and puzzles. So, I will grant this one. Some of the puzzles are pretty familiar, and the NPCs don't ever shut the frick up and let you solve them, but overfamiliar locations is simply false. Virtually all of the places that you go to are brand new and completely different than the previous places that you've been. When you go back to previous locations, you go into completely different areas you've never been to before. So those familiar locations are incredibly important, though, because you're telling the story of all of the realms and everything that's going on. Wasted skill tree abilities just betrays lack of skill and knowledge. All of the skill tree abilities have a purpose and a function, and there's depth to them because there's different armor sets and different abilities and things that you can invest in, which is part of the replay value. I actually think replay value is one area where the game suffers because there are portions of the game where you're not really doing things with the main character. I'll leave it at that. And that, I think, hurts replay value a little bit, but there's tons of replay value, and those wasted skill tree abilities are tied to armor and builds that, again, someone who doesn't know what they're doing wouldn't understand. A weaker plot is, again, just hilariously not accurate. There's so many more pieces to the plot. There's so much more drama, so many more characters, so many more poignant moments. We just did a rewatch. We did a 5-hour supercut rewatch of all of the story elements from God of War 2018 to God of War Ragnarok. And God of War 2018 is fantastic, and it deserved its Game of the Year award. But when you look at that story and compare it to Ragnarok, they don't even compare. The depth and the punch and the scope of what happens in Ragnarok is 10 times that of what happens in 2018. 2018 is a very simple unidirectional story. You're constantly trying to go to the next thing. There's a couple of twists and turns, but you have your main antagonist in Baldur, and you have the father and son relationship that's growing and being strained as they move through. And then in the next game, in Ragnarok, there's so many different subplots and twists and turns and surprises. I'm not even done yet. And I'm like, my gosh, this is a much stronger plot than the previous game. I've had people remark that they feel like they're watching a very, very good drama, like a good TV series. And I think that is, again, if this is how they're going to substantiate that it's not Game of the Year, oh, it's weaker than its predecessor. Well, no. It's too similar to its predecessor. This is an incredibly weak argument. This is the only thing they're saying in this article, right? That doesn't mean that God of War Ragnarok is bad or even especially disappointing. This isn't a zero-sum situation, and no matter what reviews the game gets, it will still sell millions, and deservedly so. It's one of the best games of 2022, just not the best. So again, this is why reviews and opinion-laden reviews are so dangerous. They're basically saying that God of War Ragnarok doesn't deserve Game of the Year because 4 years ago another game came out that they view it as being better. That's fundamentally what they're saying. They're not judging Ragnarok as a game in and of itself against its own merits. They're not judging it against game design. They're not judging against the other games that came out this year. They're simply saying 4 years ago there was a game that came out and we think that one was a little bit better. So I guess you could do that with Elden Ring. You could say, well, there was a From Software title in the past called Bloodborne that's more beloved and more universally praised. Or maybe you could do that with Sekiro. Since Sekiro won Game of the Year, you could say that Sekiro's combat was more consistent and the story and the drama was far stronger, and therefore that's why Elden Ring doesn't deserve to win. That would not be a very winsome and convincing argument because you can't use the predecessor to judge the current game, especially when I feel the way that they're doing it is not based on the quality of Ragnarok. It's based on their interpretation of what they think should have happened, right? And again, some of this I just feel like is ignorance, wasted skill tree abilities, and overfamiliar locations. So here we have an article that's supposed to substantiate why God of Ragnarok, why God of Ragnarok is not Game of the Year, and they substantiate their article by critiquing review culture, arguing that review culture should be representative of what everybody in the world thinks, which would functionally not help anybody make a decision about the quality of a game. And then secondly, they basically say God of War Ragnarok doesn't deserve Game of the Year because we think 2018 was better. And I don't think that's a very strong or convincing argument. It feels, again, like you came with expectations. Those expectations were not met, and that's why you're saying this. It's not a judgment of the game or the game's quality. It's a judgment against your own expectations. This is precisely actually what's wrong with review culture is like the people, whoever wrote this, like you're the actual problem. And that's exactly why companies continue, I think, to trot out really safe games because everybody has expectations informed by previous games. So they just keep trotting out the same franchises. So we're getting exactly what we deserve. We basically argue that games should innovate, but every time they do innovate, they're not close enough to the original. And then when somebody does do a sequel, oh, it's too close to the original. It's the you can't win. You're darned if you do, darned if you don't. So very, very weak, I think, not convincing article. No substance at all to the argumentation. One paragraph at the end that feels platitudinous and weak. So, if you like this reaction content, hit subscribe. Check out my other reaction content. Check out Reforge Gaming, where I stream live. And I'll see you in the next Reforge reaction.